What does it mean to tame the tongue? How do you bridle your tongue? Does this have anything to do with speaking in tongues? The reason I'm doing this video is because I recently heard a pastor preach from James chapter 3 that the way you go about taming your tongue and bridling your tongue is by speaking in tongues. Today, I'm going to show you why that interpretation was wrong, why James 3 has nothing to do with speaking in tongues, and I'm going to explain what James 3 actually means. How do you tame your tongue? Alright, so let's look at James chapter 3. It says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive the stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, or mature man, also able to bridle his whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouth that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. They are so large and driven by fierce winds, yet are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members, that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it has been on fire by hell. Every kind of beast and bird and reptile has been tamed, but no one can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless God, and we curse men. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not to be so." So I recently heard a pastor preach from that verse, from that chapter, that the way you go about bridling your tongue is by speaking in tongues. Now, you don't need to be a Bible scholar to figure this out, right? If you have a modicum of biblical intelligence, you should automatically recognize that that's a wrong assumption. You should immediately recognize it. Should just click. You mightn't be able to put your finger on it, but it should just click. So let me very quickly tell you why that interpretation is wrong, and then I'll tell you what James 3 actually means. The word tongue could mean three different things. It could be a muscle in your mouth. It could refer to language, your tongue, your native language, or it could refer to speech. In 1 Corinthians 14, when Paul talked about speaking in tongues, he was talking about languages, speaking in different languages. In James, although sometimes he uses the word tongue as a reference to your literal tongue, the muscle in your mouth, most of the time James is simply referring to your speech. So already, James and Paul are using the word tongue in different ways. Therefore, that alone should tell you it cannot be a reference to speaking in tongues. Also, if you have to be consistent with that logic, that way of interpreting the Bible, you have to conclude that David also spoke in tongues. Because in Psalm chapter 39, David said, "My heart was hot within me, then I spoke with my tongue." So did David speak in tongues? That would be a foolish interpretation, and anybody could see that. The same thing is true with James 3. Just because it uses the word tongue doesn't mean it's talking about speaking in tongues. There is nothing in the context of the book of James or James chapter 3 that leads you to believe that he is discussing speaking in tongues. He is talking about your speech. So what does it mean to tame the tongue? How do we, as Christians, go about taming our tongue? Because it's clearly something that's important. Well, let's look at the structure of James chapter 3. He starts off by saying, "We stumble in many ways, but if you don't stumble in word, you are a perfect man and you are able to bridle the entire body." There are many things you could do to offend people, but words are the most dangerous ones of all. With words, we can make or break a relationship. Let's suppose you are having a problem in a relationship with somebody, not necessarily a romantic relationship, but any relationship. And you're dealing in your mind with a lot of resentment and anger towards that person. That's fine. You could go before God, and the Bible says when you stand praying, forgive. So you could go before God and say, "God, help me to deal with my anger for this person. Help me, take away the bitterness. Heal me of this pain so I could truly forgive this person." And if all of that happens between you and God, fine. But if you express your anger and you tell that person everything that you're thinking, and how much you hate them, that could permanently ruin the relationship. That even in a future time, God may take away the bitterness and the anger, the relationship will probably never recover. So that's why it's important that we don't stumble or offend with words. You could offend in many other ways, but true maturity is not offending in words. And then James gives 3 illustrations to make his point. He used the example of a horse, which is a powerful animal, and you use a little bit to control where the horse goes. He used the example of a ship, which is a powerful piece of machinery, and it's a little rudder at the back of the ship that determines whether the ship goes left or right. He gave the example of a forest, which is a huge expanse. If you've ever been to the Amazon rainforest has its own ecosystem, right? It has its own climate. And a whole forest could be destroyed by one little fire. So he uses those 3 examples to show how a little thing could cause a lot of damage. Similarly, our tongue is just a small little member, but it could do a lot of damage by the words that we speak. In verse 6, James said, "See how great a forest a little fire kindles. The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell." What does that mean? Right, obviously the tongue is not literally a fire, and you can't tie in the fire in James 3 with the cloven tongues of fire from Acts chapter 2 and say it's a reference to tongues. No, that's not the right way to interpret the Bible. James is using a literary device where he made an analogy, but then he's borrowing terminology from the analogy and bringing it into the real life application. Let me give you an example of how that would work. Let's suppose I am preaching a sermon on the prodigal son. I would say the prodigal son wasted away in his inheritance, and he was wallowing in the mud with swine. But then he came to himself and he said, "I have a father." Then I turn to the audience and I say, similarly, you need to stop wallowing in the mud with swine and turn to God today. Now, nobody in the audience is literally wallowing in the mud with swine, but they know exactly what I mean. I'm borrowing some of the terminology from the analogy and I'm using it in the real life application. James is doing the same thing here. He just talked about a forest being set by a little fire. Similarly, the tongue is a little fire that could burn up the entire forest, the entire course of nature. He's being very poetic, clearly. And I should point out that Paul uses a very similar literary device in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. You could check that out. And if you could find a verse where Paul uses that same literary device, type it in the comments. Let's see how you did. Alright, but what James is doing here is talking about the difficulty in taming the tongue and the importance of taming the tongue. It's a small member, but it could do a lot of damage. With the tongue, we bless God, but we curse men. And he says these things ought not to be so. True maturity is knowing how to bridle your tongue, knowing how to tame your tongue. And if I were to sum it up in a nutshell, what James is saying here, whenever you find yourself in a situation where somebody is irritating you or has offended you, and you want to tell them your mind, you want to give them a piece of your mind, walk away. Say nothing. Walk away. Don't tell them what's on your mind. Walk away. Think about it. Plan your response very carefully and then come back and say it. The writers of Proverbs said similar things. It said things like, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is a folly and a shame to him. Do you see a man hasty in his words? There is more hope for him than a fool." True maturity, James said, is knowing when to just shut up. If you don't have anything good to say, shut up. You see, you could have a lot of anger and resentment boiling up in your heart. If you don't voice that, you don't ruin any relationships. You could go before God, work on your anger, work on your resentment, and the relationship remains intact. But from the time you open your mouth, you could permanently ruin a friendship. That's what he's saying. And that quality of bridling your tongue, knowing when to just shut up, is especially important for leaders, because you have the ability to offend a lot of people and to offend them deeply in a way that could affect their walk with Christ. True maturity, and for that reason, many people should not seek to be leaders or teachers because of that very reason. So that's what James chapter 3 means. That's the point James was trying to make, and it's a very important doctrine. It's something that we need to pay attention to because we live in a body. We interact with other imperfect human beings. It has been said that Christianity is great except for Christians. The church is great except for the people. That may be true, but the reality is we are part of that. We are imperfect as well, and we have to deal with imperfect people. We have to relate to other imperfect Christians and non-Christians. And that's something that we need to work around. We do not live in an ideal world, and we have to know how to bridle our tongue, how to tame our tongue, how to know when to speak, when to not speak, how to carefully consider our response so that we respond thoughtfully rather than react emotionally. Those are important teachings that James is telling us how to do. But when you come up with a frivolous interpretation of scripture like the way to bridle your tongue is by speaking in tongues, you missed the glorious truths of what the Word of God actually has to teach you. If you've been blessed by this, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click that bell icon, which gives you notifications whenever I post a new video out. But social media is very unreliable, so don't depend on YouTube to give you a notification. You could go to YouTube, search for my name or search for the channel name. I plan to put one video out every week, every Tuesday at 11 a.m. So you could make sure you check for that. And check out the playlist that's on your screen right now to see all of the other videos that you missed in this series. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you, and I will see you all next time.